This will be another lesson in the series on the Drake equation. In previous lessons, we laid out the terms of the Drake equation and discussed the concept of the filters, the great filters, those factors in the equation that may be limiting the probability of intelligent communicating civilizations in our galaxy, and then the history of life on Earth, illuminating the three middle terms, N sub E, F sub L, F sub I. So we were using our own history of life on Earth to shed light on those middle terms. In this lesson, we'll look at the last two terms, F sub C and L, with F sub C being the fraction of intelligent worlds that develop interstellar communication, and then L, the length of time such civilizations release detectable signals into space. So we're presuming already that we have a planet with intelligent life, F sub I, and the question is, what are the chances then that planets with intelligent life, those life forms go on to make technologies capable of communication? And so I think it's fair to say that our ancestors 6 million years ago would have been one of the more intelligent species on the planet. So we're starting the story with an intelligent ape 6 million years ago. Now, humans are just one among several ape species with relatively large brains. But it was only one large-brained ape species that developed technology. Here we see a radio telescope in the Milky Way. So it was us, not the chimps, not the gorillas, not the orangutans. Our ancestors had to adapt to a new and challenging environment with dangers but also opportunities. Consider over here some opportunities, different food sources, but of course there were new threats as well. So this was a new environment that our ancestors had to cope with that the ancestors of chimps did not. In our species, bipedalism freed our hands to manipulate the world and build tools. So with Australopithecines like Lucy, we see bipedal apes still with small brains, but now they're walking upright. And here we see a drawing of what Lucy's kind might have looked like. And then sometime later, perhaps this is Homo habilis, cracking some stones together to sharpen an edge, perhaps to use that sharpened edge to cut meat from a carcass. So our ancestors began to make stone tools. And of course, this would have favored modifications of our hands to be able to manipulate tools more effectively than chimps can today. In our species, culture was the key to success, and this selected for larger brains capable of linking minds. So it's in our species we see the great expansion of the cerebral cortex. Our brains got bigger. And the idea is that bigger brains were necessary to process culture, to learn culture, and to use cultural knowledge and to pass on cultural knowledge to our group members. Up top here we see kind of a cartoon of a home base where living out in this dangerous environment, cooperation was critical to success. There was just a lot more to learn here, and a lot more to figure out, a lot more problems to solve for our ancestors trying to live in this new environment than compared to chimps living in the forest. Of course, the principal way that we link minds today is language. And so up top here, what is language? Well, we make these sounds that can generate meanings in another person's brain. That's a really, really interesting capacity. So with language, we could link our minds together and to discuss what we want to do, to discuss what we know about the world, to discuss how to best solve problems. So language facilitated group cohesion, cooperation, and technological innovation. We have lots of question marks here because it's not clear at what point language emerged. Some think perhaps in the last 200,000 years, but others think that perhaps even farther back in time, our ancestors began to use language. So just as we fashioned new spears and cutting tools and boats and things to do the things we wanted to do, so too we invented new words to capture new concepts, both about the external world, but also we could use words to describe our inner mental lives. Now, for the last 200,000 years, most of that time we spent as hunter-gatherers. But then some 10,000 years ago, we began to settle down and start to grow our own food. And at this point then, agriculture, larger settlements, and competition with other human groups triggered rapid technological progress. Over 10,000 years ago, we have some of the first temples. Religions and myths attempted answers to profound questions. So for thousands of years prior to that time, our human ancestors were burying the dead. And by 5,000 years ago, religions helped to maintain cohesion and cooperation in larger groups, encouraging pro-social behavior. So as human groups, as cities got larger with larger populations, it becomes more challenging to manage all those peoples. And so religions served a critical function. They incentivized people to do the right thing, or else gods might punish them. As well, in these larger cities, we start to have more social stratification. So many individuals were producing food, but then there were others that were craftsmen and artisans, and then others were politicians, and others were priests. So we begin to see social stratification where people take up different positions in society and do different things. Around this time, writing was invented. Writing allowed cultural knowledge to be recorded, shared, and examined with deliberate reflection. And then we have the emergence of Greek culture. The ancient Greeks applied adversarial discussion to politics, philosophy, law, and science. Here we see Plato and Aristotle. Philosophers began asking questions like, what is real? What is knowledge? What is justice? And it was through adversarial discussion that they tried to illuminate these concepts. But ancient philosophers did not yet possess the habits of scientific inquiry, of testing ideas about nature with observation, experiment, and argument. In an earlier lesson about the emergence of modern science, we saw this picture here, the web of knowledge. And this funnel or filter is this checking process that we call the scientific method. Only ideas that pass this checking process get to be inserted or installed into the web of knowledge. So the Greeks were discussing lots of things, and they had adversarial discussions, but they just didn't habitually, systematically do this checking procedure using experiments. That had to await the 1500s. So notice now on the top timeline here, we have the ancients back here 2,500 years ago, and then there's a break here. Here we have the 1500s, the emergence of modern science. Well, what's that all about? Hypothesis testing. So over here we see the format for scientific thinking. We test hypotheses with experiments, and then we draw conclusions based on the results of the experiments. And this has proven to be a powerful way to eliminate inaccurate, incorrect, wrong ideas about how the world works. And around this time as well, the printing press connected curious people around the world. Books and journals united individuals into scientific communities seeking shared knowledge. And in the 1700s, civilizations harnessed large quantities of energy to power their economies and drive scientific and technological progress. Here we see an early steam engine and a locomotive using steam power. So that brings us then to more modern times. And now we'll look at some of the history related to the use of communicating technologies. Maxwell's equations. Maxwell helped us understand that light was one form of an electromagnetic wave. Electromagnetic radiation was this oscillation of an electric and magnetic field, and light was one example of that. Radio waves were another. In 1901, Marconi was the first to send a wireless transmission, a radio signal, across the Atlantic. And here he is with some of his equipment. This was the birth of radio as a communicating technology. Carl Jansky, using a radio antenna, detected radio emissions from the Milky Way, the core of the Milky Way. So this was the first time that we learned that other objects in our universe were emitting radio waves. And in 1937, somebody made the first dedicated radio telescope to detect transmissions from the galaxy. And along comes Frank Drake in 1960. He's considered to be the father of SETI. He begins the first deliberate attempt to detect signals from some other communicating civilization in our galaxy. It was called Project Ozma. He named it Ozma, the Oz from the Wizard of Oz, a place very far away, difficult to reach, and populated by strange and exotic beings. So they decided to listen for signals from a couple of chosen stars. They did not detect any alien signals. And SETI continues to this day. There are teams of scientists using radio telescopes all over the world that are dedicated to listening in for radio messages from alien civilizations in an attempt to answer that most profound question: are we alone in the galaxy? In 1974, something different was attempted. Instead of listening for radio signals from others in our galaxy, humans purposely sent a radio message out into space. And this was at the Arecibo Observatory. This is a giant radio dish in Puerto Rico. The information sent included information about basic numbers and atomic numbers for elements, and the formulas for sugars and bases in the nucleotides of DNA, as well as the structure of DNA, the double helix, and the shape of a human being, and the height of a human being, and the population of humans on Earth, and the sun and the planets, and information about our solar system, and the radio dish that sent the message. So this would be one way that others in our galaxy might detect us. They might detect our radio transmissions. But there's another way they might detect us. In 1977, humans launched 2 spacecraft, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. And the purpose of these missions was to study the outer planets. But after doing that, they continued their journey until today they have left our solar system. On each of the Voyager spacecraft is a golden record. It's literally a record with grooves. There's a stylus as well, and instructions for how to play the record. So if any alien civilizations come across Voyager 1 or 2, they might have a chance at playing this record and decoding the information that's on the record. What's on the record? Information about Earth. The U.S. president at the time was Jimmy Carter, and he wrote the following message. This is a present from a small, distant world, a token of our sounds, our science, our images, our music, our thoughts, and our feelings. We are attempting to survive our time so we may live into yours. We hope someday, having solved the problems we face, to join a community of galactic civilizations. This record represents our hope and our determination and our goodwill in a vast and awesome universe. The astronomer Carl Sagan was in charge of compiling the information on the record, the pictures, the earth sounds, and the musical selections. And you can learn about the content of the record at NASA's Voyager website. So, how do we assess then the likelihood of a planet with intelligent life where the intelligent life develops communicating technologies? Well, let's go back to the early history of humans and the emergence of hands and brains and culture in one ape species. Perhaps this was a low probability event. It required, some climate change that split that population of ape ancestors into 2, some of which stayed in the forest and some had to make a living in the grassland habitat, the woodlands and grasslands. Well, if that climate change hadn't happened, perhaps we'd still just have chimps and gorillas and orangutans, etc. Now, chimps, of course, are intelligent, but they're just not technological like us. They occasionally make a tool to help fish a termite out of a mound, but they just don't make the kinds of tools that we humans do. Chimps have brains about the size of Lucy. So remember, Lucy was bipedal at this point, but still had a brain the size of today's chimps. So chimps don't need bigger brains to live the way they do in the forest. Or consider another smart species, the dolphins. Now, they may be smart, but they can't build tools with flippers. So again, just because we have an intelligent species on a planet, it doesn't mean that they will necessarily be able to go on to develop communicating technologies. There might be important obstacles to that type of future. Back to the chimps. Chimps are well adapted to forest life without a lot of culture or technology. So again, even though chimps do have hands, they can manipulate things to some degree. There just wasn't a need for a lot of cultural learning in order to succeed as a chimp in the forest. So the sequence of events that happened in our species may indeed be a low probability event. So it may well be that the critical obstacle on the way from F sub I to F sub C is this aspect of our early history. That it was just one ape species that had this particular sequence of events. Bipedalism, stone tools, meat eating, cultural learning, larger brain, language. So perhaps that was a low probability event. But once you get modern humans with big brains and language, for most of the time we were hunter-gatherers, but at a certain point it seems likely that populations would get to a certain level where humans would begin to see the value of growing their own food. You can just grow a lot more food if you settle down and plant and harvest. So once you get modern humans, perhaps it was just a matter of time before you get settlements and farming. So maybe that's a high probability event. And then once you get civilizations, so large numbers of people living in cities, and you get social stratification, well, that's going to allow some individuals to pursue intellectual endeavors. There's going to be other people getting the food and the water and, building stuff and whatever, leaving some individuals to think. And so it seems in the context of civilization, where people are specializing in different tasks and different functions in society, it was probably a high probability event that some folks were going to be pondering the nature of reality and what is truth and what is justice and trying to figure stuff out. So we'll give that a high probability. Now, why the Greeks are celebrated for sort of applying this adversarial discussion approach to many domains of life, politics and law and philosophy, they didn't fully apply it to the world of the natural sciences. So we won't see the flowering of modern science just yet here in ancient Greek times. That would have to wait till the 1500s, where the adversarial discussion was applied to nature. And what we mean here is the systematic attempt to use experiments to test ideas, not just conversations with others, but to do experiments to test hypotheses. So with the habit of adversarial discussion, well, with respect to nature, it was only a matter of time that people, in trying to, argue their position, are going to resort to doing something to either prove themselves right or the other one wrong. Well, what is it that they had to do to persuade others? They had to do an experiment. So perhaps this was a high probability event. And of course, then once you have modern science, it seems that it would also be a high probability event that you're going to understand electromagnetic radiation and build technologies to detect and to send electromagnetic signals. So to summarize our thoughts on F sub C, it may well be that the lowest probability event was that sort of deep history of our species. That part of the story might be the obstacle to a civilization capable of interstellar communication. But once you get a large-brained ape with hands to manipulate the world and language to connect brains together, perhaps it's a high probability event that such a species goes on to have a history like this, leading to technologies that can communicate with other civilizations in the galaxy. And in support of this, we can take a look at the intervals of time that it took to achieve certain milestones. On the bottom timeline, 6 million years it took for evolution to modify an ancestral ape to become the human species, a bipedal ape with an opposable thumb and a large brain and a capacity for language and cultural learning. Once modern humans emerged, it took only 200,000 years for them to begin settling down and growing their own food. And then once they began agriculture, it was only 5,000 years until we have the emergence of civilizations with large populations that were stratified into different occupations. And then 2,500 years later, we get the flowering of Greek philosophy. And then it was 2,000 years from the ancient Greek philosophers to the origin of the modern scientific method. And 500 years of modern science brings us to today. So the intervals of time seem to significantly decrease, suggesting that once you achieve, a milestone, it's easier or a more high probability event to achieve the next milestone. Now let's end this lesson with a short discussion of L, the length of time such civilizations release detectable signals into space. And here we've highlighted in more modern times some possible threats to civilization, and these are technological threats. So while technology gives us the capacity to communicate with others, potentially in our galaxy, it also raises the possibility of our own extinction. And here we have 3 notable threats: nuclear war, climate change, the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, increasing the greenhouse effect and warming our planet. Also in the 1960s, Rachel Carson wrote a famous book called Silent Spring, where she alerted the world to the dangers of using pesticides like DDT and how they were negatively impacting ecosystems. And then we have the potential threat of AI. So the big question is, what's this value for L? How long can a communicating civilization last? Presumably, if it has the technology to communicate, it might have these other technologies that threaten the existence of the civilization. And the value of L is difficult to estimate because we have only one known civilization to base our thinking on. And unfortunately, for many who think about the Drake equation, L may be one of the most significant terms in the equation, and yet it may be the term with the greatest uncertainty. Some even suggest that we could approximate this more complicated Drake equation in the following way, that N is approximately equal to L. So the longer a technological civilization can sustain itself without destroying itself, the greater number of civilizations there will be in the galaxy. So we'll just have to see whether we are an example of a civilization that can live with our own technologies, hopefully long enough to make contact with other civilizations in our galaxy. Let's hope our species has the wisdom to make our own destruction a low probability event.